Good evening, everyone. It's a marvelous occasion to be here, back with you on Head to Head, wherever you are in St. Lucia and in the diaspora. As always, this program, we try to educate. We don't try to be political, but to educate people. And a lot of the issues, yes, may be political, but we are not here to be political. We are nationalists per se. You know, we think of St. Lucia first. St. Lucia must come first. We are really, in a sense, passers by. We have to develop this country for our children and their children. So tonight is going to be engaging because I have with me Mark Hennecart. And everybody knows that this man, I don't need to even say much more about him. The thing that I found out about him is that he is a lot like me in the sense that we are environmentalists. St. Lucians probably don't know part of my first degree is the environment. And to meet another environmentalist, because even in England, I belong to what we call the Green Party. So I always cared about the environment. So welcome, Mark, to this head-to-head program.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much for coming. Mark, as I just mentioned, I see that, and I didn't know, yes, you're an architect, but I didn't think you were that strong into the environment. And that, really, began to make me feel, good Lord, there is another one here, And so really, why were you so interested in the environment?
Because, Dennis, when I halfway in pursuing architecture, my career was punctuated by the great Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, at which it was claimed over 110 leaders had been in attendance and speaking to two issues at the time. For the first time, environment and development were being addressed on the same platform. And I went back to School of Architecture the year after that, and recognizing that so much came out of Earth Summit that the School of Architecture had not yet started to respond to. And some of the phrases coined then was that some of the most destructive informants of the environment were architects. Because quite rightly, it's like we are waving this broad band, on a canvas. We're looking for that canvas of the environment everywhere to then punctuate it with development. But development that was not sensitive to so many issues that were coming on. And if you remember, the UN had met 20 years before that, in 1972, to talk the world oil crisis. And at the time, it was a battle between the North and the South. By the time they got to Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, it was the East-West agenda. And every time it spoke to the environment, every time it spoke to the human condition, every time it spoke to trying to create a synergy between rich and poor nations, of which the unit of it is either the family or the human person. And then I started to take note of that and recognizing that I had a serious responsibility if I wanted to pursue a career in architecture. And then it just went on to another. Then in 20 years thereafter, after 1992, it was 94 when the Earth Summit, but for small island states, was held in Barbados. So it came closer home, by which time you realize that you got to be on the side of being an activist, being an advocate for the environment. But that environment is really about the human condition. It's how you look at housing, how you look at the resources that we use as architects, where they're coming from. And then slowly, issues started to rear their heads, and then you see initiatives coming into place like LEED, developmental guidelines, where you can't only concern yourself with the immediate environment or the immediate site, but the materials you're going to use, where are they coming from? To what extent they are causing destruction in the environment.
Therefore, I now put a an important question to you. Uh, when you look at the environment, and then you look, say, for example, our one of our regulators, I would say, that is the DCA. Do you think that, in giving planning permission, that they care about the environment sufficiently?
I think the rapport, the experience that I have had with a number of persons within the DCA, they mean well.
Mm-hmm.
Some have left, have moved on, and they have not realized what they would have otherwise, their dream would otherwise have been. And some continue to just see it as a job, day-to-day job. But I think the DCA and the legislation that is in place to enable the DCA to function well, it works. However, I still think there's too much interference at the political directorate level.
Mm-hmm.
In so much as some of these mega projects, we call mega within our environment,
quite.
Integrated projects that have impact on landscape, resources, utilities. These must be looked at in a way that will not impact negatively on all the other stakes or stakeholders, interest areas. And I think we're not doing sufficient of that. But to answer your question, as an entity informed by referral agents, DCA doesn't give a decision on its own, or the board. It has to depend on referral agents like the fisheries department or forestry department or WASCO or Lucelect or the tourism sector to inform a decision before it's handed down to a development or a developer. So it needs that information to take a reasonably intelligent decision. And I think these agencies are aware, they are functional. However, they can be overridden. Everything can be overridden because of the legislation by a cabinet decision or a ministerial decision.
Well, to be honest with you, I have something which I have in front of me, which I wrote in 2003 in the Mirror. And the question I asked then is, can regulators be effective at what they do? Because I am a little bit concerned about DCA and its regulation. And you just mentioned how many entities are involved in making a decision.
Informed decision.
And yet we hear that government can override that, because we've heard that for certain projects that DCA approval was not given. Or
partially given.
Yes, or partially given. How does that work?
The DCA approval and we're talking not of a residential,
Right,
a small house. We're talking
Yeah.
about a substantial development that can impact, communities. And these developments, I see them as organisms. They come in to reside in a community, and they must make themselves comfortable. The host community must adopt them, but they must come in there and not genuflect to the community, but complement the community, provide jobs, ensure that there's a synergy, almost symbiotic relationship between this new organism, which it's a hotel, perhaps, or golf course maybe, but it is a living organism. It is breathing like us. It is ingesting and sustaining itself. It is excreting, producing solid waste, sometimes toxic waste. It can get sick if it's not looked after,
Yes,
and
quite.
it can eventually die. And when it dies, a community around it dies because it gets infected. So if we look at these organizations and organisms in such a manner and look at the relationship they must have with the host community, then we want to safeguard that community. So that DCA's form of approval is almost three-part. In the first instance, you got outline approval, so that a developer minimizes his initial cost of determining whether that project is viable and relying on the government's Development Control Authority to guide him. So he does not want to engage architects, engineers, geotechnical engineers, and pay them these types of fees only to find out these projects can't work, it's not approved for your site. So you have what is called a land use plan approval, where the DCA would look at your proposal and said, well, you would not be able to get all of the land approved for commercial or touristic, but part of it. So you will need to go back to the drawing board with those concept designs and look at leaving a parcel, a substantial part of that entire site you're looking to develop, and retain it as natural green space or for agricultural use or for whatever. Secondly, the concept plan needs approval. So the developer then produces, with very little cost to him, a detailed plan that will give the various sectors, the health authorities, the utility companies, the road transport network systems, all of them will get an appreciation of how this organism is expected to be hosted in that community and what impact it's likely to have. At that stage, the DCA makes a decision that we can't take a decision unless we get all these agencies assemble what we would call an impact assessment.
Yeah.
Currently, the impact assessment is still an environmental impact assessment, or sometimes there's a requirement for social impact.
Quite.
I think, given the current situation, it must extend to historic impact, cultural impact, and then perhaps you want to look at the social, looking at other aspects of social, geographical, for instance.
Archaeological.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you are safeguarding elements of our culture, our identity, our well-being, our St. Lucianness, and not just the question of environmental impact or social impact. So that you need now to bring in other specialists to inform a decision, and that's my call to the authorities that, listen, we have to safeguard all the elements of our culture.
But Mark,
in that regard.
you know, bringing in all those entities in, and the decision being made, can government then override that?
Yes,
and it doesn't matter which government.
Yes, there is latitude within the law for that to happen, and we have seen it happen, where even when that information is available, and for instance, an EIA would speak to the threats, promises, and perils of an aspect that the relevant agencies may be concerned with, it can be overlooked.
Why? Because you know, these are people who are the experts in the field. They are bringing, say, for example, fisheries or wherever, the agricultural, they see things. They then come together, you know, engage each other, and then come to a decision. And a decision that will not have an impact on the environment. Why should government be able to override that?
I think, in a very subtle way, the casualty that comes to mind very, very quickly is the St. Lucia National Trust. The St. Lucia National Trust had a seat on the DCA board, meaning that they would have access to that type of forward planning that a cabinet of ministers are taking, in which they are a part of the decision-making process. The St. Lucia National Trust were removed. I can't remember exactly when, but they no longer hold that seat, and they are now just an arbitrary referral agent. And sometimes the positions that they would adopt on a matter, we have seen very recently on some of the projects that have surfaced, they're totally disregarded. The position of the National Trust is totally disregarded. And in so much as they go through the exercise of engaging their own resource persons within the trust and its membership to look at some of these issues, irrespective of that, they don't impact the decision. and have in recent times not impacted the decision.
So you're saying not only the National Trust, then I take it because the baby of the National Trust, the Archaeological and Historical Society, and
Absolutely,
others
and that's it.
are
Sidelined,
also
you know.
sidelined.
Yes.
So, in other words, do you think that government see them as the troublemakers?
They see them as hindrance to the forward planning because the emphasis continues.
But shouldn't
to
it be the development of the country that matters more
Uh,
and what benefits the country
should be.
for future generations to come?
Absolutely.
Isn't that what it should be?
Yeah.
But
That's right.
why they don't they see that? Because don't forget, it is the voters who have put them there, and I'm sure a lot of the so-called voters are environmentalists. They would want to see what we used to have, like crayfish in our rivers and things like that, which we don't see anymore. And
I
these
think-
are the problems.
And the paradox arises when you consider that on the one hand we're sell ourselves as a destination, you know, and we have to offer a few things that are different to our neighboring territories. But then again, when our visitors do arrive and they see the type of degradation taking place in some of the very
Exactly.
areas that they were invited to see, that the trust was saying or the Hotel and Tourism Association was saying, then we are at a point where we have to do damage control. And sometimes it's often too late.
But almost a point of no return.
And the point
You
of
know,
no return.
Well, we'll break off here for the first break, and we will come back because I want to know or to talk more about this environmental degradation that is taking place, especially with the so-called tourism that we talk about.
Sure.
Well, once again, welcome back. You know, we were really excited because, it was exciting for me. I hope it's exciting for you, the viewers, because Mark and myself seem to be on, although I'm putting questions to him, but it seems as though we think almost in that light of development and developing St. Lucia in the best way possible without doing damage to this pristine land of ours. I call it pristine land, and I take a pride in saying that. Mark, something I want to ask, because we talked about degradation, the environment, the infrastructure. Yesterday, I think I saw 4 ships, 3 in the harbor, 1 out, but the
Tenders
smaller one
were
was
coming
bringing
in, tenders, crafts, yeah.
And I am saying, look at the amount of people that come out, and we have to make all this arrangement for them through our infrastructure, our roads, our this, our that. But what I observe in my observation over the last year or 2, or even 3 or 4, is that a lot of the bigger ships that we have, and we've made so much effort to bring them in. Yes, we get head tax, but our head tax is one of the lowest in the Caribbean. But what happens is that in the past, say for example, Bermuda used to make sure the ship stays 2 days in port. Head tax was much higher than what we have here, about 3 times, 4 times higher. But they would say to the ships that you have to close down, say for example your bars and things of that sort, on board. But these bigger ships now, the people who come, a lot of them, I must admit to you, use their credit cards, you know, to even book their,
Yes,
journeys.
arrangements and journeys, yeah.
And when they come here, all they want to do is to take pictures, and it's almost as though to go back and say, well, I've been to St. Lucia,
Yes.
but they have not spent 1 cent. How can we continue to develop the infrastructure that we want for our children and their children based on, say, tourism that we think so much of,
Yeah.
and nothing is coming out of that? I'm talking financially,
Yeah.
monetary. Where is the money that comes out of that? It looks as though we put it in, but nothing comes
It's coming
out.
return. Dennis, I have been, in the last quarter of a century, been involved with perhaps the most developmental projects on the island.
Correct, I
And
know.
a number of types of projects and a number of studies.
Yes.
And it really concerns me that a lot goes into developing those studies, and they
Correct.
end up in someone's drawer, you know, the bottom drawer, and they're never referenced, to the point that persons are in the administration of government are unaware that studies had happened within the periods of even 5 to 10 years.
Well, not cutting you short, I just want to put that in quickly, and you can then carry on. When you say this, Suzy Dover's, late Judge Suzy Dover's constitutional
That's
reform,
reform
it's
document. Yeah,
just sitting
that's right.
somewhere there
Yeah.
after we spent so much money on that, you know. So as you were saying, you know.
Yeah. So that I have been involved with urban studies for Castries and urban transportation studies for the northeast quadrant. And as recent as 2005, with the assistance of the French government, we looked at the transportation model for Castries to Gros-Islet, land base. But the study also examined what were the possibilities that we can expect with sea-based transport. And what we came up in 2005 with was, I mean, very, very cursory, that it would have cost then about 80 cents for a single stage to take an otherwise commuter, land-based commuter, by sea, a ferry, from Rodney Bay Marina to Castries, either Point Seraphine or the North Wharf. If that were in place, it could extend to Marigot.
Yes.
It can extend to Canaries, Ancillary, where the Japanese had already put some floating jetties out there. Go on to Soufrière, Choiseul, Labrie, and Vieux-Fort. Now, consider that the ship is in harbor, and that study then had forecast 900,000 cruise passengers per annum.
Wow.
We were able to handle. We are trying to have Huronora Airport handle that million passengers per annum. But cruise passengers, you can encourage them, almost coerce them to get off, get on another small craft, and see the western coast of the island. And you stop somewhere to have lunch or to have a cocktail. And they did not need to come to land. If they did not need to come into Castries where the congestion is. They did not need to even get onto a coaster or some land-based vehicle. So that was one option that could have come from that. Of course, you know, who would have had objections to a sea-based,
Yes, quite.
right? So it has never materialized. There is a little bit of it, but it's planned cruises that some of the passengers come off. They would have already swiped their card and come off, go onto another vessel, do a cruise or to the west coast. But it's not really getting back, you know, and trickling into the economy. I still believe there's opportunity to pull those studies out and see what we can extract from them, even now, 15 years later. Also, we planned substantially in association with the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean, cricket play in Caribbean, the World Cup 2007. That was the opportunity then to implement legacy projects of the Cricket World Cup. And I was involved with a number of those master planning legacy projects, one of which was pedestrianizing a substantial part of Castries waterfront district and business district.
Which is very
and
not
beautification of it.
Which is very important because just take one of my favorite countries, and people will say, Mr. Taiwan. Yes, it is so important to go to Taiwan and see that for cyclists you have,
right.
for walking
Yes.
for running it is there.
Yes.
Everything is there.
Even the
you know.
cable, yes.
You name it. And I'm saying to myself, we have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Can't we see, because the majority of them go there,
Yes.
surely they must see that Taiwan was not like that, but it developed that because that was more important. And now Taiwan is one who cares for the environment more than anybody, or the majority of. Look at this, for example, and you were talking about as an architect. Why in heaven's name can't we make use of, Grosile on the other side of the island, to Vieux-Fort or Dennery to begin with.
Yes.
Develop that. Business comes in that area, and I would have said that tourists, the same tourists could come that ways too, build little harbors in there.
Yeah.
Why can't they think that way?
Dennis, the history tells me, and that I know of, there was a little, I think there may be a remnant of the runway that was at Grand Anse.
Correct.
Why can't we recreate it and have a helicopter rides or even small craft, touching down there to give another aspect of our product? But I agree with you. And the track, in the first instance, can be a dirt track that you open up, you grade it, and you can have these vehicles, that the amphibians can run through that, cross the rivers, and create an experience, not just for the visitor, but for our own people.
Exactly.
For our own
but
people.
It's not only that. Then the commotion and what you get now
Yes.
would be eradicated to an extent. Because we bring more vehicles, but where is the space for those vehicles?
And the other aspect to this is that I am aware, many persons are aware, that 2005, the period between 2004 2007, when we were preparing for Cricket World Cup,
yes,
we saw the need. St. Lucia had by then won the bid to host a semi-final match. A semi-final match, according to the bid book then that we qualified for, meant that Beauséjour had to upgrade to 30,000 seater stadium. On average, as when with the what we call overlay decommissioned, it is back down to 13,000 seater. So the question is, how do you shuttle 20,000 people, the majority of whom are coming in from land, by sea, and by air? You have two airports, one in the south, one in the north, and the cruise main terminal in the north. You really need to get at least 15,000 people shuttled to the match for the preliminary round matches and the semi-final. You need to get them in that area. So transportation from those ports of entry to the venue had to be upgraded. And I say so knowing full well that plans were in place for the dual carriage 4-lane highway from the roundabout at VG to Beauséjour, Grosile.
Which is essential right now.
We built it up to Union, and only a few months ago, it was completed. What had not been done was completed, albeit in not as a manner as the rest of the room, but it's completed. Hats off to the government for completing it. It took at least 9 lives were lost during that period of time before they saw the need to replace and enlarge one of the lanes so that you have a dual carriage go northbound.
Yes.
But we need to continue it.
Yes.
As much as I understood, the QAT fund had already been in place and had been negotiated twice.
Right.
To have it happen, but the project has been abandoned for a second time. But what does that do to us? It creates the bottlenecking. A longer journey, you know what they say, Dennis? The journey multiplies to the point of clogging. And clogging used to be by Sandals. Now clogging is on the Wyndham Morgan.
That's right. Yes,
right.
yes,
so
yes.
It's transferred. But
just,
it's still clogging in 2 directions.
Yeah.
However, who suffers? Productivity. Schools.
Correct.
Yeah, the kids going to school who are still now competing in the commuter sector with the working force.
Yes.
We don't have a vision plan, Dennis. The bottom line is a lack of a vision plan that I think, and I'd be presumptuous enough to say, it must be so sacrosanct, it must be so constitutional that no successive government, once it's gone to parliament, once the people have decided that's what they want, you can't come and halt it.
Exactly.
You've got to build on what was started.
But then we can say that, as I maintain, that both governments have been guilty of procrastinating.
Yes.
And they seem not to understand that procrastination is the thief of time. Because we've lost all that time,
Yes.
we have not done anything. And instead of going ahead, because you remember at one time we were ahead of the other Windward Islands.
Absolutely.
Today, we are falling behind.
Yeah.
And then you have to say it is because governments themselves have procrastinated too much.
Yeah, you see it in education, you see it in
Correct.
health, you see it in the transportation sector. And then, of course, the knock-on effect of that is in an industry, manufacturing, and all the other social services that need to now support a thrust homogeneous in such a way that all of us are moving. You get some stragglers, but all of us are moving in the same direction. We have lost that. We have lost even the zeal to see people wanting to pull themselves out of the situation. We learned, you know, unfortunate as it was, natural disaster has taught us something, but the space of time between, you know, serious disaster affecting us, we've lost that drive to roll down, roll up our sleeves and work.
But
build,
you know what you're
rebuild.
just saying, that there is so true, because a lot of people thought that Dominica was falling back, but even though it has not gone as far as it should, but at least natural disaster really gave them the impetus that
yes.
it needed
Yes.
to move forward, and they are moving forward, and rapidly too.
Yes.
And consequently, we did not do that even after we had our disaster with the hurricane.
yeah.
But it is something that it seems as though that maybe government on itself, the St. Lucian government, want us to be more retarded, because they can manipulate us and use us, well, not you and I, but the population as see fit, so they can just throw things down your throat instead of saying, no, we have people here who are capable. Let us, you know, bring them forward, engage them, and let us develop this country. We are going to take another break here, but something that I want to talk about with you, and I think it is pertinent to the extent because you have the experience. It is why wasn't St. Jude finished, say, for example, under the first United Workers' Party government? Welcome back, you know, and as I just said, that as we have heard, and then I asked the question about DCA approval, and because we were told that, say, for example, St. Jude did not have that DCA approval, and consequently, it looks as though the first United Workers' Party government was building without approval, and I found that strange, that whether government needed DCA approval on projects such as something that was already there, you know. So yeah. I don't know much about that. So Mark, I'm hoping that as an architect you can tell me.
Yeah, I think there's an example where you can get a ministerial approval to proceed in a situation like St. Jude needing to be redeveloped quickly, and limit the amount of downtime that they otherwise would have spent having been relocated to the sports stadium. So it is not unusual for a cabinet of ministers to take a decision that we would waive approvals ahead of getting work started. But all of the designs, all of the drawings, everything that would then constitute a requirement for approval will be developed and then handed to the authority on a phased basis. So I can imagine something like that was happening, but the emphasis would be getting in there and starting to do the recovery and redevelopment. As far as I was made to understand, that may have been the route that was being pursued. Unfortunately, Dennis, if you remember, September 2009 was when the fire took place. By October of 2010, we were confronted with a worse disaster that St. Lucia had imagined since Allen, which was Thomas.
Thomas, yes.
The efforts that the then same UWP administration had to deal with was recovery not of a hospital but an entire island. St. Lucia was fractured, if you remember. Soufriere was cut off.
Yes, go
so on the other side, the Badlil was cut
yes.
off, and for perhaps a period of about a week, there was no motorable access from one side to the other.
Yeah, because I was the director of the Government Information Service at the time, and we had to cover a lot of the areas, trying to film to show people what was going on. Indeed, that was
That's
true.
right.
Yes.
I was then with the government of St. Lucia looking at the school rehabilitation project, the BEEP project, Basic Education Enhancement Project. So the project then was looking at some selected schools, 8 selected schools, 5 primary and 3 secondary. The project could not continue with those selected schools because after Thomas, evaluation was done. You recognized schools that had not been but were in worse damage and disrepair than those and things. But coming back to what I was saying, then the evaluation had to take place for healthcare. And remember, 2010, the construction was going on with OKEU. St. Jude was in the throes of being constructed, but the government was thinking then of building a new hospital other than reconstructing St. Jude. And they were looking at a new site for a new hospital. Thomas had that vision punctuated and reviewed, and then subsequently they reverted to the redevelopment of St. Jude.
But that was taking place. It should have, for me, to an extent, it should have taken the sort of reconstruction of what St. Jude was, should have taken 9 months. That is within
that's a surgical ward.
Yes, that's within what, say, for example, I hate to put it that way, but the Taiwanese builder, had
whole year.
Yeah, I didn't want to mention the name, but you have mentioned the name. Whole year had said, and I had the plans.
Yes.
But the thing is, UWP got out of power and Labour came into power. And instead of finishing it, they went on to this bigger idea that I think that was in offering long before the quadrant, having that huge hospital,
a regional complex.
Exactly, to complement the airport also and things of that sort.
Yes.
And that was where they borrowed the 20 million US from Taiwan. Shouldn't they then have accelerated that process to finish it? And from what I'm getting, it should have been finished before the election.
Yeah, and there again, you see these projects, you can look at them in isolation of the history and the background. The UWP government was faced with the initial recovery work for Thomas. Yeah?
Correct, yes.
And they started to get the necessary revenue going to the international lending agencies, streamlining what it is has to be prioritized to get done. However, election came through in a year after that, November of 2011, and there was a change of government.
Correct.
The SLP inherited all what UWP had started.
Correct.
Because they had started recovery and had to finish it. In the middle of trying to finish it between 2011 and 2015, 2016, when the government was changed again, there was yet another disaster, the Christmas East trough.
Yes, yes, indeed.
And a lot of the projects that I knew, I mean, I was working on an education project that came to a halt, and we had to reallocate funding to look at other schools. The schools, listen, what was interesting, Thomas, Tropical Storm Thomas, brought wind and water, more water than wind, and it disrupted lives, especially on the West Coast.
We saw it in Soufriere,
right?
It was terrible.
But there were landslides.
Yes, correct.
And a lot of displacement of soil.
Correct.
Thomas was followed by the Christmas Eve trough, which took that mud and displaced mud and spread it into the villages. So you didn't just get water as with Thomas, but you got land displacement and mud. So the exercise was far greater for recovery and more costly than it was for
Okay.
Thomas. But Thomas was extensive. But you are now, what's Thomas disrupted and displaced, it's washed into the villages, especially onto the west coast.
That's
So
right.
more
Yeah.
substantial damage.
Parts of Soufriere
And yes.
was
So,
devastated.
so that it was a double whammy,
Correct.
for the west coast. A bigger displacement and a lot of projects that were in the pipeline had to be put on hold.
But
So there's hardly much recovery happening by the turn of the election of 2016 that you can understand why St. Jude was not a priority,
but
because they were finishing.
but when this government came into power, we are told now that St. Jude was almost 90% finished. So why wasn't it finished? Why was it put on hold to the extent that I'm going back to my first question, that it did not have DCA approval?
I don't know. The question of what percentage it was complete at the time of the
Yes. Yes.
2016 election is debatable. But what I can imagine is the argument is that if the scope of the work increases, completion will drop to a lower percentile figure,
Quite.
right? Because if it was, as you say, the surgical wing,
Yep.
by the time the project team recognized that a lot of the roofing of all the remaining buildings, in spite of them being intact and not affected by the fire, but the asbestos roofing had been impacted, you couldn't just
Correct.
replace the
I
surgical.
know.
The whole environment became a concern. So the decision taken to remove the asbestos roofing meant that the whole building would be exposed.
Yes.
And you then take a decision to, if you're going to expose the whole building, it affects the services, electric, lighting, everything there. You may as well undertake to do it.
Because
but there was
I
no stream of revenue dedicated to that work.
Because I remember the older building had two surgical wings for operations.
Yes.
But the new plan was for three.
For three, yes.
Yeah.
And they were, something in the region of about 50% prepared.
I know that.
Up to I saw it in April of
I know that
2017.
because in 2016 I had all the information in Taiwan,
Yes.
so I was well aware where they were, and Holdier was the one who was supposed to be doing this, you
yes,
know.
yeah.
So in a sense they were getting there, but what I am saying is that having been there, it looks as though we went back in 2016
Yeah.
when everything was stopped.
But then there's yet another component to it. It speaks to, if your society is becoming more tolerant and less engaging in criminal activity is taking place, then the budget for combating crime can be reallocated, or part of it reallocated to education or other social services. And I think that was the plan of the 2005 National Health Reform project, or whatever it was called. In that, if you move into a healthier society and your citizens are becoming healthier, you are no longer referring to even the health centers as health centers, but wellness centers. The mindset is that you are tending towards wellness. Then
So it's almost like the Romans thinking prevention is better than cure.
cure, that's right. So then it was an opportunity for us to work towards completing OKU, in my view. I'm not saying that's what was done. Look to complete OKU and put emphasis into that, and wellness by developing the wellness centers and bringing them into a point where community-based wellness, health and wellness provision can almost take you to a point where St. Jude can be down to a large polyclinic. So that it's feeding. If you get from a wellness center, you've community-based, you go into a community hospital or polyclinic, then referrals from there could be to one general hospital. Because we are just 180,000 people. I keep mentioning, having studied in Jamaica, St. Lucia fits comfortably in one of the 14 parishes called Clarendon. And there was a community outside of Kingston that I recall having population, that's Portmore, having a population in the late 90s of 200,000 people trying to get into Kingston on a morning. And they work on a local government budget.
But you know,
how can we not manage a national
but
budget
looking at
with
things very
180,000
quickly
people?
because of time consuming, don't you think too that what for me this government should have done was to finish St. Jude, and then, to be honest, having a medical school, which they're doing now, was also necessary.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But St. Jude should have been finished first.
I agree.
I have to give them kudos for this idea of medical school. But that could have come afterwards.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and if we are thinking and not party, we think of St. Lucia first. Health, as you have just pointed out, is so important.
Yes.
Both governments have failed us in that. And I make no bones about it because I'm a nationalist. And consequently, I think this government did the wrong thing about now getting rid of 2 buildings and then deciding to put a medical school. No, we should have finished what we had, then bring in the medical school. What do you think?
You're absolutely correct. I think that we could have worked with the space already built there.
Correct.
And if things are so badly built that warranted demolition, then certainly look at how you can retrofit them.
Correct.
For a lesser use than creating a situation where the hospital cannot be supported by these badly built buildings. But you have now increased from the figures given, a building that would now have been 165 up to December or up to June of 2016, it was 165,000 square feet. You are now pushing it and double to that. It's as far as I understand, it's over 300, nearing 320,000 square feet of space that you now have to, Dennis, service, fit out with equipment,
yes, indeed,
furniture and fixtures, and you have to operate it and maintain it at a huge cost. It will be the largest structure on island, larger than some of the hotel resorts that we have. And the cost of maintaining, of running and maintaining this, it will be humongous.
Yet we were saying that that we had a problem with retrofitting OKU.
Yeah.
You know, this really doesn't make sense. But we're coming to our time. Well, I just want to give you a quick thing. How do you see us going very quickly, and in what direction should we go?
Simply put, my philosophy is, you mentioned the learned judge, Susie Dovern. Constitutional reform, we should adopt the aspect in it that persons had called for, which is local government, reinstating local government, empowering people within community. Let these people make a determination on what they want. Soufriere Square would have been an example of what the people wanted. It was interrupted. But at a local government level, decision making could be reduced. Central government can focus on the bigger projects and bigger picture, and small communities can manage within their sphere of competence to undertake to do projects that are to the heart of the people that they serve.
Mark,
a vision plan where the person is center
yes.
is where we need to go.
Mark, honestly, I wish we had 2 or 3 hours to talk because I think we are on the same wavelength,
yes.
And that has to do with the development of St. Lucia, not for you, not for me, but for our children and our children to come. I enjoyed this discussion, and I hope you out there enjoyed as much as we did. I hope also it's not just a discussion, but the learning process has taken place, and we do understand a little bit more than when we first began, because that is what learning is all about. And this program is, I hope, will be the center for learning in St. Lucia from television. I want to thank all St. Lucians, as I said, even those in the diaspora who will have an opportunity to see these programs on you know, their different phones and things of that sort. And I want to thank those who have watched us tonight and listened tonight. Mark, I want to say once again, thank you. I wish we could have just gone on and on and on.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much.
Yes.
Okay.